I'm Norman Gilliland, here at the Lodge in Manitowish Waters with Ann Hillerman, author of several books of nonfiction and fiction, but most recently, and perhaps most famously, picking up the storyline where her father, Tony Hillerman, left off after writing many novels. And a pleasure to be with you, Ann.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be with you, too.
Well, let's begin with the setting here, which is the American Southwest, New Mexico, and we go over to Arizona, too, at times in these books. And since that's such a big part of the books, your novels, tell me about your background, your family background in the Southwest. How deep is that, and how big a part of your life growing up was life in the Southwest?
Well, I feel so enormously lucky. My dad's background was in journalism. So he had been working, he worked for some small papers in Texas and then Oklahoma, and he had become a state capitol reporter in Oklahoma City for a news service known as United Press International. And he was doing really well with that. So, I mean, this is our family legend, of course. I don't have any proof he was doing well, but I think he was doing well because they offered him a promotion to come to New Mexico to be the bureau chief for United Press International in Santa Fe. And I don't think he realized at the time not only was he the bureau chief, he also would be the whole bureau. So that was 1953, and so I was about 3 when our family moved from Oklahoma to Santa Fe. My dad had been to the Southwest before. Right after World War II, he had come to Crown Point at New Mexico driving a truck of oil drilling equipment. And that really was his first introduction to the Southwest. So I think I know he was happy to get away from the steamy green of Oklahoma and move to someplace where he could see the stars. And he was also happy to have this promotion in terms of his career in journalism. So our family then lived in Santa Fe for about 10 years until my dad got a job with the University of New Mexico, and then we moved to Albuquerque. So basically, even though I was born in Oklahoma, I lived my whole life in the Southwest.
And tell me about your life as a New Mexican. I mean, did you kind of live the life that we'd expect of, riding horses and learning to speak Navajo and that kind of thing, or what kind of lifestyle did you have as a child?
Unfortunately, no. When our family moved to Santa Fe now is a very sought-after resort place. There was an article in Esquire magazine in the '60s that featured a lot of hot tubs on decks with the stars overhead. But when I was growing up in Santa Fe, basically it was a town of about maybe 30,000 people. Our family being non-Hispanic, and particularly my mom and dad being from Oklahoma, where we didn't have any relatives there, we were very much outsiders in that community. I think the thing that connected us to most of our friends and neighbors was the fact that both of my parents were Catholic. And Santa Fe at that time was, because of the Hispanic tradition, I think the Catholic faith was a very strong uniting factor. So because of that, my parents really were embraced. And then because of my dad being in the newspaper business, a lot of people had stories that they wanted my dad to look at. So yeah, that was all fun. I went to a school for girls, a Catholic school for girls, which was good in some ways. I mean, we were really pushed, I think, to be the best we could in terms of math and learning everything, science, reading, of course, and writing. And so then when my dad, I'm the oldest of 6 kids. So when we were in Santa Fe, my parents were wanting to expand our family. But my mom wasn't able to have children. So we, in Santa Fe, my mom and dad adopted my oldest younger sister and my next oldest younger sister, and one of my 3 brothers. So our family was growing. So my dad, anybody who's been in journalism knows that you don't make money in journalism. So my dad loved his job, and he was working like 60 hours a week. And my mom was doing basically the 50s housewife things. And us kids were happy. We were, riding our bikes and going swimming and, learning how to play tennis and exploring the arroyos. And anyway, then when I was just starting the 8th grade, my dad had a chance to move from journalism to the academic life. He had been the editorial page editor for the Santa Fe New Mexican. And at that time, one of the legislators had come up with a bill that all of the faculty at the University of New Mexico should sign a loyalty oath.
This is the McCarthy era.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And my dad said, no. And he wrote a very strong editorial against that. And so afterwards, the president of the university contacted him. And he said, we are really needing some help with the legislature in terms of our funding. Would you be willing to come to work for us in the, as a lobbyist, basically? And then, after that, you could, we would help you get your master's and you could teach journalism. And my dad loved being a reporter, so it was a hard decision for him. But besides his newspaper work, and besides being the dad to all of us kids, he also had been working on writing fiction. And I can remember when I was a kid, we would have our dinner, us kids would go to bed, and then I would hear tick, click, 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 click. That was my dad back in his bedroom office working on his little Royal typewriter.
And those carriage returns.
Yeah.
With the ding.
Plug. And so my mom said to him, you really need to write that novel. I know that in your heart, you are going to be a fine fiction writer. And I know too that if you're supporting us, supporting our family on this journalism salary, you'll never really, it's going to take, if you ever get this done, it's going to take you forever. She said, I think moving to Albuquerque would be a good idea if you can get your master's, get into the academic schedule where you'd have more time to write. That would be great. And my dad was hesitating, and my mom said, I can get a job. And she already had a job. She was raising all of us kids, and she was teaching catechism at church. But so anyway, I think due to her support, then our family moved down to Albuquerque. And that was where I had to go to school with boys. It's like, whoa, it was a terrible shock.
Brave new world.
And also the school that I transferred to was a school that was probably about a year behind where I had been at my school in Santa Fe. So I could not wait for that year to end. Oh, it was awful. But I have to say, what saved me, I think, was that the house my parents bought was about 3 blocks from our public library. And so every day after school, I would just run over there and hide in books. And so in the summer, and the librarians were really sweet. So then about May, they said to me, we have a job, it's called a page. And this would be a person who would, when books come in after people have read them, you'd put them back on the shelf. And they said, would you like that job? And of course, I was so thrilled. And looking back at it, I don't think they really even needed to hire me. I think they just felt sorry for me. But that kind of helped me get through the summer. And then things were better. I went to high school, and there were other kids who were new kids. And meanwhile, my dad did his job with the legislature, and then went to school and eventually got his master's and was able to really then focus on writing his fiction.
Did your parents read to you when you were young?
Oh yeah, a lot. And my dad also, every night he would tell us stories.
So he'd actually
and
make up
me
stories.
and my brothers and sisters, and I, we would be the heroes of these stories, and often they would be continuing adventures. So, just like in a mystery. So you get to where the chapter ends and you want people to turn the page. So Dad would always say, now, if you want to find out what happens next, you have to go to sleep. So it's like, okay.
So already you were into sequels.
Yeah, right.
Right.
And into knowing how to build suspense.
Sure, yes. And now, as far as what he was writing at this point, as we get to, 1970, by the time you're of age, and this is when The Blessing Way comes out.
Right.
And
I think some of what he was writing probably was the start of the Blessed Way. And some of what he was writing were articles for, besides his work at the newspapers, he also would do freelance articles. And some of those articles were articles that later he was able to kind of recycle into what became his master's thesis, the Great House Bank Robbery. So I think some of what he was writing was probably that.
so we're already getting into crime.
Right, right.
And
I think if you're in the newspaper business, you deal with a lot of crime. You know, whether
Sure.
it's corruption on the school board or
Politics.
legislative hanky-panky, yeah.
sure. And are you at all interested in writing at this point, by the time his first book comes out?
Yeah.
What kind of things are you writing?
Journalism.
Are you? Okay.
Yeah, I think if you grow up in a family where you are lucky enough to have a parent who is so passionately involved in whatever their career is, it kind of rubs off on you, you know. And also, my parents were really wonderful in terms of encouraging me to write. You know, I love to write little stories, and I would show them to mom and dad, and they'd say, you know, they always would say, "Oh, isn't this a lovely story?" But often my dad would say, he'd say, "You know, here where you say, you know, the girl is sitting under the tree." He said, if you said she's, and this is, if you say it's a cottonwood tree, and the leaves are shaped like hearts, or the sun was warming her skin, so she moved in the shade, and she enjoyed how much cooler it was. He said, if you know, just give it some more details, it'll really bring your story to life. And he was such a good dad and a good teacher. He was able to say that without saying, you know, this isn't very good. It's kind of boring. That was the underlying message, of course. But you know, he did it so well. I always felt like I was a good writer, even when I wasn't.
And what kind of things were you reading at this point? Other than Tony Hillerman, of course.
Well, I wasn't reading, I mean, when I was growing up, of course, Dad hadn't published yet, so. And I don't remember ever reading his articles in the newspaper. That's funny, but I was reading the Black Stallion books, Walter Farley. I loved all those books.
Girls and horses, you know,
Yeah.
there's no separating them. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's an English writer named Edith Nesbit. She wrote The Five Children in It, and it's a whole series. And they're really wonderful books. And I was looking at them a few years ago, and they're good stories, and also it's kind of complicated language. You know, so I'm thinking, you know, reading these, they probably did my brain good, you know, when I was in the 5th and 6th grade. And Nancy Drew, of course.
Oh, Nancy Drew, very durable stuff.
Yeah.
Again, girls and Nancy Drew, hard to separate them too.
And when I was, right before our family moved to Santa Fe, when I was in the 8th grade, my dad had a wonderful friend who worked with him at the newspaper, and he gave me a book. It must have been this thick. It was the complete Sherlock Holmes. And I was thrilled. It was like a grown-up book. You know, here I was just 13, but that I think I read every story. And
so mysteries
Yeah.
and detective work start to come together in your interest.
Yeah.
Where does the Navajo interest come in then for him and for you?
Well, for my dad, it really started right after the war. You know, I mentioned earlier that he had this job driving this truck out to Crown Point. Well, when he got there, he noticed some people all dressed in ceremonial regalia on horseback. And he thought, this is something I haven't ever seen in Oklahoma. So he asked one of the people at a trading post, you know, what's going on here? How come these people are so dressed up and they're all going somewhere? And the man he talked to said, oh, some of our Marines have just come back from the war. And so their clan is having an enemy way ceremony for them. And Dad knew what a clan, enemy way ceremony. And Dad knew what a clan was, having come from Oklahoma. But enemy way didn't mean anything to him. And so, you know, I think there were big question marks in his eyes. And the man at the trading post said, you know, if you want to go, I think that would be okay. He said, just behave yourself. I don't know what he thought my dad was going to do. So Dad went to the ceremony, and he often said that night really the sound of the drumming and the chanting, the beauty of the costumes, the smell of the wood smoke, the coffee, the mutton cooking, and the brilliance of the stars overhead. He said all of that, and not only the physical stuff, but the idea that the Navajo Nation understood that these young men coming back from what they had seen during the war would really need some help becoming part of the community that they left. He said the wisdom of the Navajo culture, and of course this was before PTSD was even an acronym. He said that was really the start of his love affair, both with the Navajo people and with the landscape that is so integral to their spiritual life.
We hear so much about the difficulties of being a Native American today and life on the reservation and the problems with them. Do those apply to the Navajo also? I mean, the Navajo is the most populous of all of the tribes in the country, some hundreds of thousands, right?
350,000. Yeah. Not all of them live on the reservation itself, but yeah, it's a lot of Navajos.
And so do we see on the reservation those same kind of problems with alcohol and unemployment and I suppose depression too, among other things?
Domestic violence, yeah.
Poverty, of course.
Yeah, all of those social issues that are connected to poverty and connected to living in a place where it's hard to find a job. Yeah. I mean, it's not, there's not like a lot of murder or a lot of, say, burglary. Most of the problems really are connected to alcohol, and they have to do with, people getting drunk and losing their temper, and, somebody gets hurt, and then somebody gets arrested.
There are
and drugs. I mean, that's
Sure.
another issue, and part of that is because of the isolation on the Navajo Nation. It's easy, and it's not so much Navajo people as, say, a Navajo woman will be married to somebody from outside the nation, and then that person has some friends, and they know this is an isolated area somewhere, and they set up a meth lab. So it's kind of exploiting the distance and the isolation on the reservation for bad needs.
Does that come out in Tony's books, or does he emphasize more individual characters and their issues, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I think more individual characters, but of course we're all part of a community. So those individual, and I'm trying to think, I should think on that question a little more. I'm sure there are stories where Dad certainly alludes to domestic violence. In Skinwalkers, there's a woman who has a hydrocephalic baby that's going to die. And of course, the whole reason that this happens is because healthcare is very difficult. If you're poor and you are isolated and you don't have a car and you probably don't have much education, all of that then contributes to problems like that. But in the book, Dad doesn't so much deal with why this baby has been born with such difficulty. He mostly deals with the woman's the world she lives in which this not only probably is a medical thing, but it also is a spiritual thing. And somebody must have witched me for this bad thing to have happened.
And this is a thread that comes through not just his
Right.
books, but yours also, this concept of witching people.
Yeah.
Now,
Did I answer that question?
yeah,
Okay.
For now.
Sometimes you ask a question and it just leads to a story, and then I'm over here.
that's okay. We don't need to
Okay.
be too literal about this. It's all about the story, as you know, and that's where we are. Law enforcement on reservations. Now, there seem to be multiple layers of it, but to what extent are the reservations autonomous when it comes to law enforcement?
It really depends on what the crime is. Say if somebody steals a car, the Navajo police would be solving that crime.
On the reservation?
On the reservation. If somebody steals a car and drives it to Gallup, and then it would be a combination of the Navajo police and probably the Gallup City Police and maybe the New Mexico State Police. If somebody steals a car, drives it to Gallup, and in the trunk is a lot of marijuana, then the DEA would get involved. It's like an amazing spider web of law enforcement. And then, of course, and kind of over it all is the FBI.
Yeah, this is a web that, as an author picking up the Tony Hillerman franchise, you have to weave your way through. And how complicated is that?
Well, it's complicated. It's complicated. And the other complicated thing is that in the end, what people care about is not so much the intricacies of law enforcement. It's who did it and why did they do it, and how are Jim Chi and Joe Leaphorn and Bernie Manuelito going to figure this out. So sometimes I don't want to say gloss over, but I try to not get too wrapped up in all of the jurisdiction details. Because in the end, really what matters is that the reader has fun with the book and the crime gets solved and we go on to solve another crime.
Do you think your father had any inkling that you were going to be picking up that franchise after his death in 2008?
Well, we never talked about it. There are authors who have like a succession plan, particular authors who've had successful series and they talk to their publisher about it, or like Dick Francis, he and his son had been writing books together before Dick Francis died. So, but no, my dad and I never talked about it. I don't know. And actually, we never talked about my writing fiction. So I would say he probably didn't have an idea. I loved to talk to him about his writing. And sometimes, particularly toward the end of his life, my husband and I would go down to Albuquerque and we'd be talking to him and my mom, and he'd say, "Come into my office a minute, honey." And there would be whatever he was working on. And if he had a passage that he was really proud of, he would read it to me. And so I looking back at that, I wonder if he was sort of planting the seed of curiosity in my little fertile brain. But in a way, I'm glad that we never did talk about it, because I think that would have been such a weight on my shoulders to think not only all of these fans who had loved Dad for the 30 years he'd been writing, but to think up in heaven, my dad is looking over my shoulder saying, "Wait a minute, you need more verbs in that paragraph."
Did he talk about works in progress, or some authors think that that's a chiller, but he did.
He did, yeah. He often his last book was the Shapeshifter, and after that book came out, his health declined, but several times he would say to me, "I want to write this book," and it would have to do with a load of mercury that's buried somewhere. Mercury was used in mining, and it's also sometimes used in jewelry. And he was saying, but I can't quite figure out, how this would work and how that would work. And he told me told me kind of the development of that story, but I don't think he ever wrote anything down with it. But yeah, the only book in progress that he would read me those passages, say, of some book in progress, but he never actually showed me the manuscript. The only time I got to see a book before it was published was his memoir, which was Seldom Disappointed. And maybe about a third of that book, Dad talks about his experience in World War II. And he writes it very lightly, and some of it is even comic. But the undertone is he easily could have died. He stepped on what was called a shoe mine. He lost most of his foot. He got a severe infection. He was in a body cast in this hospital in France for a long time. And he almost went blind too. He lost the vision in one eye from shrapnel. But he writes this like it's Laurel and Hardy. But I think that was
sort of gallows humor a little bit, a way to get through it.
Yeah, I think so. And some of the stories, it wasn't only him. I think it was a lot of the men in that hospital who knew, their number could be up, and so gallows humor was what kind of sustained all of them. But I was really honored when he asked me to read the draft of that, and the only thing I said to him was, you don't give my mom much credit. And my mom was his first editor, and really a wonder. She took care of all the details of life so Dad could write. And so I said, you don't really give her, much credit. She's not in this book much. And he said to me, honey, I'm lucky she even let me put her name in the book. She was such a private person, so
usually that's saved for the acknowledgments page at the end, lifelong thanks to my lifelong bride for
right.
making all of this
right.
possible in the first place.
Right.